Hello and welcome to our panel today. I'm looking forward to hearing from the speakers that we've managed to gather. My name is Asanda Mwasheng and I'm going to be your moderator. So today we're discussing a number of topics which will be unpacked by the speakers that we have set up. So essentially, one of the things we want to highlight and talk about first and foremost is the coronavirus pandemic and its ability to highlight inequality. We've seen this happening all over the world, where it's highlighted inequality based on race, inequality based on gender, inequality based on ability, and so much more. And we've also seen is that the virus has exposed, fed off, and showed that there's increasing inequality all over the world. And what we've seen most sadly, as Oxfam has told us in various reports, is that billionaires have had their fortunes go back to pre-pandemic highs in just 9 months of the pandemic. And at the same time, we saw that the world's poorest people were hit so badly that it could take them over a decade just to recover. So some of the stats I thought I'd bring and highlight just to showcase the ways in which this pandemic in particular has exposed inequality, has exacerbated inequality, and continues to, is that we've seen supermarkets driving this growing inequality, and particularly the exploitation of women in supermarket value chains has increased. And while, because of COVID-19, workers globally lost 3.7 million trillion, according to an Oxfam report around supermarkets and value chains. Women and young workers as well were seen to be the hardest hit. But at the same time, we saw that supermarkets made millions, billions in food sales, because food was one of the few things that during the international lockdowns people could buy. And so what we saw is that there was an increase in food sales, which led to about 1.6 sales growth in the supermarket value chain. And a lot of retailers made money, but this money that was made by retailers did not trickle down to anybody in the supply chain. And we've gathered a number of experts in various sections of the supply chain from various countries. We have Colette, who's from Women on Farms in South Africa. We've got Harpreet, we've got Namit, and we've got Deval. And all of them will be telling us, showing us, and giving us a better understanding of what the context is like and what is the relevance of this conversation that we want to have to the people that they work with. And I think I want to just highlight quickly before I go to my panelists, some of the general key framing questions that will frame this conversation is, we're interested in finding out what commitments are needed from different actors in the global value chains towards this transition to a just economy. We want to find out what commitments for paying living wages and ensuring decent working conditions can be made, and we want to find out, does an increase in the living wage, an increase in payment of people, what impact will it have on the lives and the working conditions of informal workers along the global value chain? And we also want to find out, how is this calculation of a living wage done, and how is it done particularly from a feminist perspective? And we also then want to explore, what are the immediate and feasible measures that can be implemented in order to ensure that commitments made by various supermarkets and others across the value chain can be realized? And the last question we want to ask really is, what will be the role of stakeholders in implementing the concept of a living wage for supply chain workers in particular? And we're going to do this in two different parts. So part one, we're going to explore the challenges and gaps before and during COVID-19 in order to help us understand why it's important that we begin to commit ourselves globally to the payment of a living wage versus a minimum wage, and what this means and why it's important will also be unpacked. And in part two, we're going to try to chart the way forward and talk about which are the actors that need to act in order to bring about change and fair working conditions towards the development of a fair and just a fair transition to a just economy. So the first speaker that we have coming up is Colette. Colette, if you can tell us a little bit about, the work that you do, the organization that you work for, and what are some of the working conditions that women on farms face in South Africa, and why did you decide in your research to move beyond a minimum wage and start talking about a living wage? Thank you, Colette. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Asanda, and thank you for the organizers of this very important discussion. Well, Women on Farms Project is a feminist NGO that works in South Africa. We work with women who live and work on commercial farms, primarily wine farms and grape farms in the Western Cape and the Northern Cape provinces of South Africa. I think it's important, before I talk a little bit about the conditions themselves in, it's important, I think, for me to preface that by saying it's important to understand that the labor conditions that farm workers experience in South Africa must be regarded in the context or as an outcome of a globalized economy and a globalized value chain. And in this value chain of wine, for example, women farm workers who produce the wine, who work on wine farms in South Africa, are on the lowest rung of the value chain. And we know that all along the value chain, there are various players. And it's important to understand the value chain also in terms of the power dynamics. So women farm workers are at the lowest rung of the value chain, and they also have the least amount of power and are therefore highly exploitable. And if we understand women's labor conditions and their experiences on farms in terms of a globalized value chain, we find that at the top of the value chain, we have supermarkets, we have retailers in the global north who are exerting increasing price pressure on farmers and suppliers in South Africa. They want to pay less and less for South African wines so that consumers in Europe and the global north can pay, can buy wine very cheaply, good quality wine very cheaply. And the consequence of this downward price pressure from supermarkets in the global north is that farmers respond to this pressure by cutting, by looking at where they can cut costs. And obviously the first thing that they target is farm workers' conditions, farm workers' rights. And so therefore we find in South Africa, despite the fact that we do have relatively good progressive labor legislation in place, we nonetheless still find widespread violation of farm workers' labor rights on farms. So in research which Women on Farms did a few years ago, we found that 3/4 of seasonal women workers were not paid the minimum wage. The majority of women seasonal workers are exposed to pesticides. The majority of women seasonal workers do not have access to a toilet in the vineyards while they are working. 73% of women seasonal workers said that the farmers prohibit them from joining trade unions. And I think, to me, the most shocking statistic that we found was that 88% of women farm workers during the winter season experience hunger. And we know that because women farm workers work mainly seasonally, so for 4 to 6 months of the year, they are unemployed effectively for the rest of the year. And during those periods of unemployment, they experience acute hunger. And I think that as participants, as activists in the globalized value chain, we need to take on board the fact that, number one, labor conditions on farms are probably worse now than they have ever been. With the COVID pandemic, the vulnerabilities and job insecurity and the precarity of women's labor on farms has been exacerbated. And then secondly, like I say, the fact that the people who produce our food themselves go hungry is also a massive wake-up call for us that something needs to shift in the globalized value chain. The globalized value chain at the moment is not really bringing any benefits, material benefits, questions of dignified work, fair work. It's not bringing any of that to women farm workers in South Africa.
Thank you very much, Colette, for getting us started in our conversation. Of course, always sad to hear about the conditions that the people who produce the food and produce the products that we consume, the conditions that they are forced to live in while we get to enjoy their products. I now move to Deval. And the question I have for you, Deval, is can you tell us a little bit about the organization that you work for and the working conditions, particularly of informal workers in your work in India, and how is the conversation around a living wage relevant to informal workers? Thank you.
No, of course. Thank you again for organizing this panel and allowing all of us to hear about the differences and unfortunately lots of similarities that exist in terms of oppression in multiple countries. And thank you, Colette, for sharing, because farm labor across the world, like you said, do not get the same level of respect, dignity, and equity as their employers or the shops that their products are sold in at a global level. And I think it's important for all of us to recognize that and realize that. And so I think in the Indian context, one of the things I think that everybody saw sort of when the first lockdown happened last March was literally hundreds of millions of people walking home, thousands of kilometers with children in tow, because they were not just locked out of their place of employment, but the majority of informal workers, especially those in urban centers, actually live in their place of employment. And so when the factories were shut, the homes were shut, their groceries were shut, everything was shut. And I think it was those images and not just the images clearly that we saw in the newspapers, but being in India, we saw this firsthand that we realized this is just ridiculous. These are the individuals, as Colette said, have built our cities, are providing us food to survive. Many of them in the domestic workers industry look after our children. They are the reasons we're able to thrive, and yet we've treated them worse than most. And this treatment honestly has gone on pre-COVID, but it took COVID, a global pandemic once in a century, for us to realize how bad the situation was. In the Indian context, 230 million people moved back into poverty last year. And that was in 2020, not even from 2021, the second wave and the health crisis that we all again saw on television. And so that just gives you a sense of poverty. Since Colette spoke about agriculture, I think we will actually speak a little bit about the non-agricultural jobs or the non-agrarian informal workers. So India is home to 270 million non-agrarian informal workers, 270 million. Just to give you a sense, that is almost as great as the population of Germany, United Kingdom, France, and Italy combined. And so 270 million is not a small number at all. 40% of this population earn less than the minimum wage, which is between $2 to $3 a day. And women typically earn only 30% of their male counterparts. So women in this country who are constructing the same buildings as their husbands are literally earning 60 cents a day to do this grueling work, and of course have to look after their family at the same time. In urban areas, just to give you a sense, a casual or informal worker is usually paid half of what a permanent employee is doing and has zero benefits. And so only 8% of India's workforce is part of the organized labor workforce. Therefore, all of the great laws we have in our country protect that 8%, but 92% are not protected. And unfortunately, the 270 million individuals we're speaking about constitute that 2%. That is the issue that we see at hand. I think what we saw in COVID was a few things. I mean, I think number one, just the realization that we've treated these individuals worse than we could have ever imagined, and there was a need for a change. But number two, that helped us as DASRA, an organization that's been working in this nonprofit sector for 22 years, to really understand what are some of the root causes. And while the general public came out to provide support in transporting these individuals back to their homes, providing them food for a few days until they were able to get home, structural issues needed to be solved for. And in that research, we realized, number one, when COVID happened, 78% of workers that we were able to interview through our partners had less than $5 in their pocket, and 50% of them had less than 1 day of food rations to survive between them and their families. So the conditions have been extremely, extrememly grim. And what we've seen is none of these individuals have rights. Very few of them are actually registered with government programs and schemes. So they're underrepresented from both government schemes as well as from vote banks. To give you a sense, in the construction sector, which has 50 million in the construction sector, there has been a fund that was set up by the government of 180 billion rupees to support these construction workers. Unfortunately, though, the issue has been $5 billion, or 62% of those funds, still rely in government coffers. I hope you can still hear me okay.
Yes, we can hear you. There's a little bit of a break, but we can hear you.
Okay, great. I may just turn off my video if that makes it easier. But the reason I bring this up is if 62% of funds that are in place for construction workers have not been utilized, even at this time of crisis where most construction was stopped, it hopefully there is a need to also engage the corporates themselves and civil society to not just hold the government accountable, but more importantly, to do things that the government is not able to do. And hopefully I'll speak about that a little bit more in my next session.
Thank you so much, Deva. I just want to wrap us up quickly, to bring you both, Colette and Deva, just to talk a little bit about, what does it mean to find yourself homeless during the pandemic? Because we, as the middle class or people who don't also live at work, we don't even think about what it would be like. We're thinking about being stuck during COVID in your house, and you're not thinking about what it's like to actually be homeless during COVID because you were living at work and work has closed. I don't know if you want to take a little bit of that, Colette, and then Deval, just give us a little bit of that understanding before we move to the second section.
Thanks, Asanda. So for women farm workers, I think the most difficult thing that they experienced, have been experiencing, but especially during the harder lockdowns, was simply running out of food. So as you know, children were at home, adults that were employed in towns came back home as well. So there were more mouths to feed in the house, and yet there was no work. It coincided with also with the off season in South Africa in the winter months and so on. So women literally ran out of food. And also lots of the social networks that they would ordinarily rely on, going to another farm, to a sister or a cousin, relying on the church, all of those informal social networks also were obviously no longer operational. And I think for women farm workers who actually live on the white farmers' land, they also experienced basically an inability to move. So they were almost prisoners on the farmer's farm. The farmer said, if you go off my farm today, I'm not allowing you back because you're going to come back with the virus. So they were actually trapped on these farms, unable to get to towns, unable to move around, and actually forced, in effect, to buy food at inflated prices from the farmers. So that was one thing that we saw at the farm level. But there was also, when we looked at government's sort of social protection or some of the responses that government introduced, I think they displayed or demonstrated just a lack of understanding of the context of farm workers. So, for example, they introduced food parcels. No food parcels reached farm workers living on farms. Farms are private property, they're far away from towns, so food parcels just did not reach farm workers. The government also introduced a scheme, a special grant scheme that workers could apply for, but you had to have a smartphone, you had to have data, and you had to be able to make this application online. So that immediately excludes, 80-90% of farm workers who are unable to access this special relief grant, etc. At the same time, we also found that although evictions were supposedly outlawed or prohibited during this time, because it's private property, we found that farmers were actually threatening to evict farm workers and so on. So there was definitely an acute sense of, I suppose, from what was happening on paper to what was actually being experienced on farms. And then as the rollout and as the people started to go back to work and so on, we also found that farmers, for example, if a worker had been tested for COVID, but was waiting in isolation at home before going back to work, the farmer just refused to pay workers while they were isolated or while they had COVID. So they were only paid for the days that they were working. Farmers have even been known to go to farm workers' houses, knock on the door and say, you haven't yet got your positive test results, so you better get back to work, etc. So we found that there was a sort of a new level of farm workers' rights being violated, not only their labor rights, but just their human rights, their health rights, etc. And like I say, I again come back to it, hunger was acutely experienced by all the farm workers.
Well, thank you so much, Colette. Really quite depressing news about being imprisoned in your own home or in your workplace. I can't even imagine what it must be like to be undergoing that and the pandemic and being unemployed technically and going hungry on top of everything else while having to homeschool children or find a way for children to just survive the pandemic, I suppose. And I mean, I'm sure that Deval, you're going to share similarly heartbreaking stories of the degradation of human rights that COVID in some ways allowed those with power to do. Yeah.
No, and exactly to Colette's point, I mean, again, the population of 4 largest European countries moving back to rural India, just assuming that was the case and that happened. And so how do you have food for 270 million people who've not lived in these areas? How do you actually provide income where majority of them had income from the same sort of issues we saw in rural India? And then the same stories, just like Colette said, I mean, very large respected banks and companies in the cities had a similar policy, which is you can live and work with us, but then you have to not leave office compound for 4 to 5 months. And these are well-respected businesses. And so it was a prison, and the businesses would talk about this as if they were doing a favor to these individuals, where in reality it was prison, and they didn't know about their families. They didn't have any way to contact them. They had no idea what was happening there. These were sort of the issues that emerged, and many of them, even with this sort of lack of dignity and equity, within a few months, given that their families were starving in rural India, had to come back to urban India with lower wages and lesser rights because they had to have families to be fed. And so if anything, on one hand, as we've seen in all the reports, not only have the rich gotten richer, but on the flip side, the rich also have not provided the same level of dignity that they may have been providing pre-COVID in these companies and businesses, just creating greater plight on these individuals. And just to give one a sense, while all of us in India at least have been on lockdown from a school perspective since March 2020, less than 8% of children in rural India were even able to access online learning classes on a regular basis. And so 92% of these children had no education whatsoever. And so when you start thinking about not just the issue with the food security on the livelihoods and the families, but that next generation is already a year or 2 or 3 years behind those of us in middle class who had the ability to log on Zoom, and our children were able to do e-learning. Majority of the population in our country, especially those from these populations, had zero access to that as well. So we've not only crippled this generation, but also the next in terms of being competitive in the future.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Deval, and thank you so much, Colette. It's really quite astounding how similar the situations are. It's almost as if there's a manual for the rich and the empowered on how to treat the poor and the disenfranchised that traverses, global country lines. Because as you're talking, Colette, I'm hearing you, and as Deval's talking, I'm hearing almost identical stories, and it just reminds me of the Oxfam report that was released recently, which just highlighted this by talking about how between 2005 and 2019, the workers' share of the end consumer price was consistently very low. And they looked at shrimp in Thailand, and they saw that it was less than 1% of the end consumer price that the workers were getting. And they went further to go look at India, and they found that between 2005 and 2019, the workers' share of the end consumer price was also consistently very low, sitting at 0.7% and sometimes only up to 3%. And in South Africa, where you're talking from, Colette, they found that between 2005 and 2019, which is the same period, was also low, and it was consistently around 1%. So you have workers in South Africa, workers in Thailand earning less than 1% of the share of the products that they are part of producing, they are part of harvesting. And in India, it's slightly better at almost 3%, but it's still very low if you think about the fact that you've got 93% of the share going to everybody else. And this, I think, just highlights that the levels of deprivation that we're talking about and that we're seeing. And I want to thank both of you for just giving us the explanation and the understanding of what the situation is on the ground, and how this is a global picture, and how this is a picture that continues. I'm sure if we were talking to somebody from Thailand or other parts of the world, you'd be hearing similar stories, because as I said, there seems to be like a manual that these various people in power are focusing on or are reading from. I want to take us now to part 2, but I suppose quickly before I do that, I just want to check if there are any questions that have been asked so far by our audience members, but there don't seem to be. So I'm just going to go now and say thank you to you, Colette. I think we have to let you go, but also you can also stay. But the part that we needed you for is done at this point, and we're going to now. We're going to now talk a little bit to Namit, who can tell us a little bit about their work and how do we begin to monitor and measure fair working conditions, particularly in Asia Pacific and beyond, which is the areas that you work at.
Thanks, Asanda, and really thanks to Deval and Colette for bringing in this astounding situation that workers across 2 continents facing. Really heartbreaking to hear that. So I work for this organization called World Benchmarking Alliance. It's a Netherlands-based organization, and we work at the intersection of responsible business practices and sustainable development goals. What we do as an organization is basically develop free and publicly available benchmarks that measure and incentivize how companies contribute towards the sustainable development goals. And I mean, we all believe that sustainable development goals are the world's best business plan towards achieving sustainable development and sustainability. And linked to what has already been spoken of, whether it's in terms of the human rights aspects or labor rights, 90% of the SDGs targets are directly connected to either international or regional human rights instruments or labor standards. And particularly for today's session, SDG 5 and 8, which look at gender and decent work, are absolutely relevant. Where we try to focus our work is on systems transformations, because like Deval mentioned, that it's not that COVID created these situations. There were these systemic issues that pre-existed. COVID just exposed them. Therefore, we believe that it's important for us to look at transforming the system, and which is why what we do is we have identified 2,000 global companies across sectors, across regions, and we feel that these are the most influential companies in the world who will help in achieving these sustainable development goals. We work across 7 different systems transformations. Food and agriculture is one of those systems. But we do want to assess all of these 2,000 companies on core social indicators. When we say core social indicators, we are basically looking at 3 aspects, and we have 12 expectations on which we will assess these 2,000 companies. And these are grouped into human rights, decent work, and ethical conduct. On the specific focus for this session, I'll just go slightly deeper into how do we assess the decent work aspects. We look at the companies from a workplace health and safety issue, from a living wage perspective, and how do companies enable worker empowerment, and also look at diversity balance across management, so not just at the entry level, but also at higher management level. What we are also trying to do, because we do multiple benchmarks, we are also embedding the principle, the SDGs principle of leave no one behind in all our system transformations. We are also looking at creating spotlight benchmarks. So for example, earlier we published our gender benchmark, which looked at the apparel sector and the conditions of workers in supply chains, predominantly women workers in Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia, and the conditions that they face. And the story and the situation is very much similar to what Colette spoke about in terms of how much of the value goes to the workers, what is the fair share, and all of those issues are very much relevant there. Similarly, we recently published our food and agriculture benchmark, where we assessed 350 of the world's most influential food and agriculture companies on how are they contributing to transform our global food system. And if I may just go slightly deeper into what are some of the worrying findings that we got from our assessment. And these are the most influential and the largest companies across the world. And in our assessment, we found that the situation is worrying not just for Asia Pacific, but across the globe. Obviously, in South Asia, there are a lot of Indian companies that we assess. There are a lot of Southeast Asian and East Asian companies we assess. And the results are pretty much similar. I mean, a little bit here and there, but across the board globally, the way you mentioned, Asanda, as if companies are following a manual to exploit people, exploit their workers. It's the same manner in which some of these things are going. And the companies that we assessed, represent more than half of the world's food and agriculture revenue, employ more than 23 million people overall. And we have found that, some of the basic commitments, for example, having procedures to prohibit child and forced labor in their supply chain are missing in a lot of these companies. We also found that, just about 8% companies have comprehensive human rights due diligence mechanisms in place. So this basically, removes the transparency aspect of what's happening in the supply chain. How are those companies taking steps to identify those issues, let alone trying to address some of those issues? And specifically from a farm and plantation worker side, Like Deval mentioned, in terms of their wages, income, they're exposed to, severe kinds of income insecurity, but also, they don't get any social benefits. Their employment is seasonal, and there are a lot of issues around that. We also found that only 9% of these 350 companies demonstrate and publicly disclose that they are taking any steps towards paying living wages. And we found that only 2 of the companies assessed have actually committed to set targets of paying living wages. So, what overall we are finding is until and unless these companies get serious about taking action on the sustainable development goals and even Paris Agreement for that matter, I think the world is not going to be a better place in coming years. Things are going to get quite worse from where we are. So I think those are some of the initial thoughts which are linked to what Colette also highlighted, and I'm happy to bring in more thoughts and perspectives in the second round. Back to you, Asanda.
Thank you so much, Namit. What a sobering and saddening analysis of the state of things. But I think I'm also encouraged by the fact that this work is being undertaken and that we will be able to have a proper analysis of how big, how wide, how deep the problem is, so that we can begin to develop the solutions that are needed to change it. I want to talk now to Harpreet, who can help us understand through, telling us about your work as well. How do you help government and business to mitigate and begin the process of addressing human rights risks and the impact in supply chains, and I think particularly the human element of supply chains across Asia?
Thanks, Asanda, and my fellow panelists for outlining the challenge, for outlining all of these challenges. I think, of course, many countries did not perform what we expected them to do in this crisis. But, I would also want to kind of look at this pandemic, in some ways, because it did provide an opportunity, for the businesses with an opportunity to also respect for human rights into their business values, playing an instrumental role in enhancing business resilience for future crises. I think, also largely to build forward better sustainability, businesses must assess the impacts of COVID-19 on stakeholders, including the impact on workers within their operations as well as supply chains. At UNDP, I lead the Business and Human Rights Asia Regional Project, where we provide technical and advisory support to governments and other state-based institutions on the development of National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights and other policy and legal frameworks. At the same time, we also promote corporate human rights policies, due diligence processes, and remediation to ensure the enjoyment of human rights in all workplaces across all business sectors and type of work or employment status in the region. In addition, we invest in research, in developing tools, but also facilitate platforms such as the regional forums on business and human rights to amplify the voices of rights holders and highlighting the need for effective remedy. Given preponderance of supply chains in Asia and a high prevalence of human rights risks such as forced labor, harassment, health and safety, land rights, gender inequality, discrimination, fair wages, the list is really long in terms of the human rights risk, but it's inevitable that a lot of our work focuses on the subject. In particularly, for example, we've been supporting a number of countries in Asia, including India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, Pakistan, in developing the national plans on business and human rights, and expectations from businesses to also mitigate and address human rights risks prominently feature in many of these national action plans, which some of these are under development. And for example, Pakistan recently adopted the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, and it does have a section that kind of talks about the impact that COVID had on the workers, in operations, in supply chains. And I think that's something that the governments or the states who are looking to develop these new policies and the national action plans must take cognizance of. In particular, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, we developed a human rights due diligence in COVID-19, a rapid self-assessment for businesses. It's a simple and accessible tool that helps businesses to consider and manage their human rights impacts of their operations. overall, it's a non-exhaustive list of potential actions that allows businesses for rapid but continuous reflection on human rights risk and impacts common to many industries. This RSA is now available in 14 languages, including including Bahasa, Burmese, Chinese, English, Hindi, Japanese, Mongolian, Russians, and various other languages. This RSA has actually been has been used by many businesses, but then also been promoted by business associations and employees organizations. So that's something that we've worked very, very closely with businesses, providing them toolkits that respond to their immediate requirements, given none of us was prepared for a crisis as big as COVID. More recently, we also developed a human rights due diligence facilitation training guide that provides training modules which clarify what is required to conduct human rights due diligence by focusing on the basics and sticking to internationally agreed principles and widely understood terminologies. We hope that this human rights due diligence facilitation training guide is, it's again a very, very simple and easy tool. We hope that businesses engage with that and use that to sort of push human rights due diligence within their supply chains. More recently, I mean, given again, we're talking about here supply chains, but we also, I think they were also mentioned initially, the informal workers within Asia, and I think he was quoting just the numbers in India. But if you look at informal economy and the numbers are again, the numbers are going to be again big. We've recently started focusing on informal economy, and what we're trying to do here is to sort of understand how do you implement the UN guiding principles within the context of informal economy, where you actually, what are some of the initiatives, but how do you engage with these workers so that we're looking at a just transition as well. And then, in specific, we do have initiatives at national level. Maybe perhaps I can share in the next segment of the session. Thanks, Asanda.
Thank you so much for that, and thanks to both of you for expanding a little bit more on the role of institutions in some ways this inequality, but also working against the perpetration of these labor rights injustices. We have a question from the audience, which I think both of you can take just to give us a deeper understanding. So the question is that Namit just mentioned that they work with 2,000 leading companies on creating transformative change with regard to decent work. But how do these companies react when confronted with practical labor rights violations on the ground, as described by Colette and Deval? And many of the mentioned companies don't pay living wages or don't uphold MHRDD themselves yet. How can we put more pressure on these businesses? And I think this goes for businesses and government as well.
Thanks, Sanda, and thanks for the question. So I think the situation where we are really a couple of steps away from matching what are the commitments and disclosures that these companies have versus what is the real practice. What I presented was very much at the commitment and disclosures level. And that is the first step. We do want companies to come forward and make those commitments in the first place so that civil society organizations, trade unions, communities can then hold them accountable. Then the question is also about, what kind of accountability mechanisms are present that can be used to hold these companies accountable. And I don't mean to suggest that we need this to happen in a sequential manner. All of these need to happen at the same time. Where we are adding value is trying to have a standardized benchmarking approach of assessing these companies and putting this information out in the public domain that is freely accessible by everyone. At World Benchmarking Alliance, we are an alliance of almost close to 300 organizations, which include civil society organizations, trade unions, and also investors. And what we have seen in many instances is some of our allies use that information and then try to hold the companies accountable in their own context. There have been cases where investors have used that information and challenged and asked tough questions to the companies in which they invest. There have been several governments who has used our methodology to do a national baseline and design legislations to that effect. And there have been civil society organizations who have also used that information at the local level to engage with those companies and ask some of those questions. At WBA, we call that we are building a bridge while walking on it. And I think that's going to be very, very important because it is a long walk and it is a very, very complicated situation that we are trying to address. So I think everybody has a role to play. We are building in that transparency element, and there are so many others in the alliance and outside the alliance who are then adding value and taking that information and strengthening the overall work. So I think that is where we are. I'm sure, others will also have something to add to that.
Thank you, Namit. Anything you want to add, Harpreet, in terms of the organizations that you work with and also just governments, how do they respond when confronted with the reality of not applying sometimes even the laws that they were part of putting together?
Sure. Thanks, Asanda, and thanks, Namit. I don't know if I can really add on to what you said, but I think also what we're looking at here is the growing pressure from consumers and investors. I think we tend to underestimate and we tend to undermine the pressures that we can have from the consumers and investors, and that also requires building capacities of consumers. How do you start engaging with consumers, and how do you build their capacity so that they understand and they start holding their governments and the businesses accountable on their human rights. We also keep forgetting one of the important stakeholders, which is which is looking at journalists, which is looking at media, and the role that media can actually play in holding corporates accountable, through knowing and showing campaigns. And that's something I think the Oxfam has done very, very efficiently, for years now, to really looking at the role of media and campaigns on knowing and showing. And I think that's something that perhaps would be very, very useful in terms of doing those reality checks. And when businesses, so I think that's really one. At the UNDP, we've just launched guidance for journalists to report on business and human rights. So that's again another tool that's available for building capacities of journalists to report on business and human rights as well. The other thing, which I think all of us as interested stakeholders, interested parties need to do, is to start collecting and analyzing data. I think there's still very little data, and we're not spending enough, we're not investing enough on research and data collection and data analysis. And I think all these numbers need to also, these numbers would speak more. So there's definitely a space for analyzing for this documentation, but then also analyzing and presenting that data. Perhaps I think that's something that could help in looking at realities versus the disclosure that these businesses are mentioning. But again, also looking at the new and upcoming requirements from trade partners, I think that's again something that's going to build a lot of pressure on the businesses to respect human rights.
Thank you so much both for those comprehensive responses, which kind of move us very quickly into the last section in the 15 minutes that we have, where we want to talk about who needs to act to bring about the change so that we can have a fair transition to a just economy. And I'm going to ask anybody on the panel, or I suppose I'll ask each and every one of you, who needs to act in the food and agriculture industry, who needs to act in terms of government and business, and what kind of actions do we need? So like what kind of policy changes are required? And also we want to find out what role CSOs can play in fighting for change, and how CSO funding for itself can help in this change. I'll start with you, Deval. Maybe let me start with Colette quickly, actually. I'll start with you, Colette. What do you think needs to change in terms of the agriculture industry, the government, and everybody else?
Sure, thanks, Asanda. So I think there's a role for all the different players, stakeholders, actors to be involved in. So for example, consumers, I think consumers need to buy into the values of social justice and consumer responsibility, and they must be prepared to spend more on wine and grapes and food and so on. And furthermore, they also have a lot of economic power, which they can use to hold supermarkets and retailers responsible to pay fair prices for wine, so that farmers can pay workers a living wage and better working conditions and so on. So that's at the level kind of consumers, one would say. But then also supermarkets, they also have a very important role to play, and they need to be obliged, forced to ensure respect for human rights, along the value chain. So they must, and that can only come about with due diligence legislation, which compels them, obligates them to actually take account of human rights along the value chain. And I think, during the apartheid years, while we were struggling in South Africa, we relied a lot on international solidarity. And that came from various sectors, from churches, from you name it, the global north, the global south, and so on. So I think that too is still there. There are still people who want to make a difference. And so whether it's about, like Harpreet was talking about, increasing consumer awareness, lots of the time consumers don't actually know what conditions are on wine farms in South Africa, for example. So I think there's responsibility for CSOs to increase consumer awareness and so on. And then, of course, international solidarity is something that we also need to rely on.
Thank you so much, Colette. I think that's a great point that also links to the conversation that was held earlier by Harpreet around the use of media in order to bring about more awareness. Because of course, if you're not aware that your favorite product is part of an exploitation chain, then you're going to continue to consuming it unawares. And so I 100% agree that the social justice awareness of consumers is important towards bringing about change. I'm going to come to you now, Deval, to say, who do you think, whether we're talking about the industry or we're talking about government and business, who do you think needs to change, and what role do you think CSOs can play? And also, if you want to talk even about how funding can also be part of that change, that would be good. Thank you.
Sure. And so I think for us, when the lockdown occurred, we went straight to CSOs who've been operating in this space for decades. And we realized that they were helping migrant and informal worker communities for the last 20, 30, 40 years. And it was up to us to really listen to them on not just how to get food and transport to these families who needed it urgently, but what were some of the structural issues that needed to be changed across the country to ensure that this tragedy does not happen again. Simultaneously, since we work quite a bit with philanthropists, a few family business owners also contacted us. And they felt as ashamed and distraught with what was happening in our country and felt that enough was enough. And they had to change their business practices, not at a 2% CSR level, but at a 100% level to ensure there's greater dignity and equity to everyone on their value chain. This is a stain in our country, something that we need to realize we're all equally responsible in contributing to, whether it's being silent as consumers, like Colette was saying, and buying the cheaper products, whether it's not providing livable wages for those who work in our homes, or whether it was as a company level to say, what are we doing, not just with those that are in the 8% organized labor force, but everyone else down the value chain, because we have an ethical and moral responsibility to ensure that they also are looked after. And so what we ended up doing was bringing the CSOs together, and they all had their own versions of assessments, similar to what Harpreet maybe was talking about at UNDP, on really helping these companies assess where they're at, be open and honest about what are the things that they need to improve upon, and put together 5-year plans to get better. We ensured the CSO designed the assessment and run the assessment, because we wanted to make sure that this is not something that just has a nice picture in the annual report and is forgotten about, but more importantly, something that is being held account to by the CSOs, again, who've been serving these communities from day one. I think on the family business side, and I say this because many emerging markets, most of the publicly traded companies are actually family businesses. And in a country like India, while we have some amazing regulations on worker rights, like I said, it doesn't pertain to most of the individuals in the value chain. So how do we sort of start speaking to these families to say, look, these are changes that are important. It's important for your own legacy, it's important for our country. And what we've been extremely surprised to see is these family businesses now are pushing ahead far more in holding not just themselves accountable at a company level, but also telling their peers who are also family business owners that this is the right thing to do. In our minds, this is similar to rooting out child labor. Years ago, yes, it was more expensive to root out child labor, and that's why people oppress children and enslave them. And that being said, it is the right thing to do, and over time, productivity will go up. And I think it's having, therefore, the CSOs and these businesses work together, create something called a social compact that we're happy to share with anyone on this call, Colette, maybe even with the farmers in South Africa, really just helping owners understand where are they with safety, health and grievances, gender parity, facilitation to government entitlements. Again, something that's quite difficult to do, even though it's there. As Colette was saying, if you need a smartphone, then maybe somebody needs to help that individual with that smartphone to register. And finally, really thinking about these workers as not as invisible, but as part and parcel of our value chain, and how do we ensure that their health, well-being, and their families also can coexist in the cities that they have built for us. And I think that's really, really important. And so we've been, like I said, really impressed to have families driving these initiatives, CSOs working side by side, but really going even beyond policies to hold each other accountable on what's next.
Thank you so much, Dewell. That was a comprehensive response. Unfortunately, we only have about 4 minutes left. So if you could just give like a 1 minute exit so we can wrap and then we're done. I'll come to you, Namit, now. Just 1 minute, please.
Sure, thanks. So I think, based on our experiences from Southeast Asia and India on the workers, I'll just quickly list down some of the recommendations that we, listed out. And in terms of the who needs to act, it is all. The governments need to act, civil society, and definitely the government. First and foremost, I think it's an issue of power. So to rebalance some of these power dynamics, it's important to collectivize and convene workers and farmers. It's also important to create a better understanding of what workers mean. It's not a homogeneous group. Even informal workers is very, very diverse and different. So having that understanding is very much important. And then having platforms for them to have dialogue and cooperation with the government, with businesses and others, so that if they have any grievances or any issues, they don't have to wait for formal legal mechanisms, which can take years and years, but can be sorted out quite quickly and at a local level. I'll stop here, in conscious of time.
Thank you very much for keeping it brief, because that gives us time for our Preet. If you can give us your exit thoughts, and then I'll wrap up quickly. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. And I'll just build upon what Namit said. I think we also, again, everybody has a big role to play, but just looking at the civil society organizations, I think there's a huge role that they can play in building capacity of workers to negotiate collective bargaining agreements, because we all know the correlation, direct correlation between the collective bargaining agreements with collective bargaining with employment, with wages, wage inequality, and productivity. And lastly, I think the business model needs to change. We're all sort of talking about here, making workplace safe, we're providing living wages, but somebody has to bear the cost for that, right? And these costs must not be paid just by the suppliers who already feel the pressure of reducing costs to maintain international competitiveness. So I think if brands are committed to promote fair labor practices, as they say, they must adequately compensate for the costs involved in meeting compliance demands that require safe working conditions and living wage. So I think purchasing practices is something that brands need to really, really look at. Thanks, Asanda.
Thank you so much, and you got us just in time. Just to wrap us up, really thankful to all the panel's speakers and everybody for their questions and their engagement. I just want to read a comment, I suppose, and a question that's come from Akmal Ali, who says CSOs also need to change. We need to be able to walk the talk, and to do this, we must push for CSO accountability. As CSOs, we sometimes have expectations and demands demands from consent business and private sector, but what about us as a question? I think that's a very valid question, that what are we doing as CSOs to make sure that the things that we're pushing for are legitimate, are fair, and I think most importantly, as Colette highlighted with the smartphone, are accessible, because when we fought for all of these things, are they things that people that we have fought for will be able to access? And I think I want to leave it there. Thank you so much to, of course, Oxfam Germany for bringing us together. Everybody down there in Rome, thank you so much for hosting us, and I look forward to having many more of these conversations and possibly joining some of the rest of the C20 conversations.